Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And before we start, a big thank you to those supporting the channel with an extra membership, especially the Scouts. I see you, I appreciate you, and I create this for you. Now, let's get started. My name is Claire Jensen, and I used to think New York City was unshakable. The noise, the crowds, the energy, it all felt permanent, like nothing could ever bring it to a halt. But that was before everything changed. I'm 32 years old, an administrative assistant at a law firm in Manhattan, and I lived what I thought was an ordinary life. Rent was too high, mornings were a blur of subway commutes, and the only real excitement was the occasional happy hour with co-workers. There was nothing extraordinary about me, and nothing in my routine suggested I'd soon be caught in something that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the world. It began the night before. I left the office a little after 7, heading out of the glass building near Park Avenue, where I spent most of my waking hours. Midtown was busier than usual, but it wasn't the normal rush hour energy. The sound that struck me first was the low, relentless growl of diesel engines reverberating off the skyscrapers. At first, I assumed it was just more delivery trucks, but then I saw them, convoys of military vehicles threading through the traffic. Humvees rolled past with antennas whipping in the wind, and behind them were heavier trucks loaded with equipment, soldiers seated inside with weapons slung across their chests. NYPD officers stood at the intersections, blowing whistles and waving them through. It wasn't a handful of trucks either. It was one after another, engines roaring as they sped uptown. People on the sidewalks stopped and stared, some lifting their phones to record videos. There was speculation all around me, bits of conversation floating in the cold air. Someone joked about an alien landing. Another mentioned the president might be visiting the city, and a woman next to me was convinced it was related to a major terror threat. I remember looking at the soldiers' faces as the trucks passed. They weren't smiling, weren't relaxed. They scanned the rooftops and alleys with sharp, deliberate movements. No one explained anything to the crowd. No one even acknowledged us. The trucks disappeared into the distance, leaving only the faint smell of exhaust behind, but the tension lingered like a static charge. That night I lay in bed, listening to helicopters thunder overhead. They weren't the occasional sightseeing tours or news choppers New Yorkers are used to. These flew low and fast, shaking the walls of my apartment. I turned on the local news, hoping to find some explanation, but the anchors were as clueless as everyone else. There were vague references to unusual military activity in several states, but no one would go on record about why. I muted the TV and tried to sleep, telling myself it was probably some big joint training exercise, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The next morning, the city felt off the moment I stepped outside. It was a Thursday, usually one of the busiest weekdays, but Lexington Avenue was oddly quiet. There were cars, yes, but nowhere near the usual gridlock. The sidewalks weren't crowded, and the constant background hum of chatter, traffic, and construction seemed dulled. I noticed more soldiers than the night before, this time stationed on corners and outside subway entrances. The 6th train stop on 51st Street, which I used every day, was closed with a steel gate and orange barriers. 2 armed soldiers stood guard nearby. A man in a suit approached them and asked if the subway was down for maintenance, but they didn't answer. One of them just raised a hand, palm out, as if to signal, "Stop talking," and looked away. I walked to work instead. The few people I passed wore the same tight, distracted expressions, glancing at the sky as if expecting something to fall out of it. At the office, conversation revolved entirely around the situation outside. Someone mentioned that major highways in New Jersey were closed without explanation. Another said a cousin in Philadelphia reported seeing military jets screaming overhead all night. We tried refreshing news sites, but the stories were all the same. Speculation, shaky videos of convoys, nothing official. The tension was thick enough to choke on. By late morning, the atmosphere had grown unbearable. Phone alerts about new closures kept buzzing, and helicopters were flying lower and more frequently, rattling the windows. Half the staff left early to be with their families, and the partners didn't stop them. I packed my laptop in my bag around 11:30 and slipped out. The streets felt even stranger than before. Some blocks were nearly deserted, while others were jammed with cars honking at each other, their drivers panicked and impatient. I passed a hardware store where a line of people stretched around the corner, waiting to buy batteries and bottled water. It was the kind of scene you see before a hurricane, only there was no storm on the horizon. I was halfway down 47th Street when I first heard it, a noise like distant thunder, except it didn't fade. It built steadily, rising into a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. People on the street froze, looking up. The clouds overhead churned like boiling water, dark shapes moving behind them. Then, without warning, the sky tore open. I saw massive shapes hurtling toward the city, shards of something so large they blotted out the sun. They spun end over end, trailing smoke and fire, and for one surreal moment I thought they were parts of a destroyed space station. Then the first one hit. It slammed into a building 2 blocks ahead of me, with a blast so violent the ground lurched beneath my feet. Glass and debris exploded outward as the upper floors collapsed in on themselves. People screamed and ran in every direction. Cars smashed into each other as drivers tried to reverse out of the street. I ducked into the recessed doorway of a closed deli just as a shockwave rolled through, knocking me to my knees. Shards of glass rained down, bouncing off the awning above me. My ears rang as I tried to make sense of the chaos. Through the haze, I saw more of the objects falling, crashing into the city like meteors. One struck the East River, sending a wall of water surging up and over the FDR Drive. Another obliterated a construction crane near Grand Central, its pieces tumbling through the air like matchsticks. Somewhere close, a woman was shouting for help. Her voice was ragged, desperate. But before I could even think about moving toward it, the shouting stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button mid-scream. That silence was somehow worse than the noise. Then I heard the first of them. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A low, resonating click interspersed with deep, vibrating tones that seemed to travel through the pavement. The fog of dust made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead, but I could tell it was moving. Heavy, fast, a man sprinted into the middle of the street, shouting for someone to help him. Before he made it 10 steps, something flashed past him with terrifying speed. There was no scream, just a sudden and final noise, and then the man was gone. An emergency alert blared over the city's loudspeakers, the voice trembling as if the person speaking knew they might not have much time. "Do not speak," it said. "Do not make any noise. They hear everything. Stay silent. Stay hidden." I stayed crouched in the doorway, trying to stay as still as possible. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that any sound could be a death sentence. The dust was thick enough to sting my eyes and catch in my throat, and I had to press my sleeve over my mouth to keep from coughing. A block away, a man trapped under a fallen street sign was crying quietly, trying to free himself. The creature was drawn to the sound instantly. When I finally saw it clearly, I almost convinced myself I was dreaming. The thing was enormous, at least 12 feet tall, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its body plated in a mixture of metallic and organic material that caught the fading light. There were no eyes that I could see, just a jagged dish-shaped head with long quivering filaments extending outward, searching. It turned toward the trapped man's sobs, pausing as if pinpointing the exact location, and then launched forward. The impact shook the pavement, and there was nothing left of him. I forced myself to move. Staying in one place felt like waiting to die. I slipped along the building wall, placing each footstep as quietly as possible, avoiding broken glass and shifting debris. Every distant noise, a car alarm, a window frame creaking, sent waves of dread through me. I ducked into a narrow alley behind an office building and pressed my back against the cold bricks, praying no one else would stumble into me. Halfway down the alley, I almost tripped over a woman huddled against a dumpster. Her eyes were wide and glassy with shock, and she shook her head slowly when she saw me. She was badly hurt, her left leg bent at an angle that made my stomach turn, but she made no sound. I crouched beside her for a moment, trying to figure out if I could help, but the alley was too exposed. If I tried to move her, we'd both be dead. She seemed to understand, giving me a tiny nod before looking away. A sudden metallic crash at the far end of the alley froze us both. One of the creatures was dragging something heavy across the pavement, the noise so loud I could feel it in my teeth. I flattened myself against the wall and waited. The sound moved away slowly, leaving a ringing silence behind. I gave the woman one last glance, mouthed that I was sorry, and crept toward the other end of the alley. The city was barely recognizable. Fires burned unchecked, and helicopters that had been circling all morning now fell from the sky one after another, swatted down like flies. I saw one go down near Bryant Park, spinning helplessly before erupting in flames. Soldiers on the ground tried to organize civilians, but their commands were whispered, frantic. I slipped past a group carrying a wounded man into an abandoned storefront and kept moving. I reached Lexington Avenue and stopped when I saw one of the creatures crouched on top of an overturned bus, its head swiveling as the filaments waved in the air like antennae. It moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, pausing as if listening. Somewhere nearby, a man bolted from cover, screaming for his wife. The creature dropped from the bus in a single, fluid motion and hit the ground with enough force to make the asphalt crack. The man's voice cut off mid-sentence, and I didn't stay to see what happened. I slipped through the loading dock of a darkened office building and found a stairwell. The door wasn't locked, and I climbed quietly, the echo of my footsteps making me wince with every step. The building's power was out, and the halls were silent except for the distant groans of settling metal. I avoided the cubicles and moved toward a window on the 12th floor that overlooked the East River. The view was devastating. Bridges burned in the distance, their support towers collapsing into the water. Across Queens and Brooklyn, I could see other jagged structures jutting into the skyline where the falling shards had landed. Smoke blanketed the city, and the normal roar of Manhattan was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness broken only by the occasional distant crash. I stayed by that 12th floor window for nearly 20 minutes, trying to come to terms with what I was seeing. There was no traffic, no sirens, no honking horns, just the orange glow of spreading fires and the faint, almost rhythmic sound of something heavy moving through the streets below. The longer I looked, the more I began to spot movement. Those things, those towering creatures, sweeping between buildings and picking through wreckage with limbs that flexed like scissor arms. Every so often, they'd stop and extend those twitching filaments from their heads, as if tasting the air for vibrations. Then they'd spring forward with terrifying speed, targeting something, or someone, I couldn't see. After a while, I forced myself to move. Watching from above felt too much like waiting to die. I made my way back to the stairwell and started descending slowly, 1 foot at a time, staying close to the wall. Every creak of a step or brush of my boot against metal railing made me flinch. My apartment was still a dozen blocks away, and every block felt like a potential trap. The lower levels of the building were dark, only faint daylight leaking through the entrance doors. I paused at the lobby, listening for any movement before easing the door open and slipping out into the side alley. The air smelled like scorched plastic and gasoline. I decided to move east, skirting the edge of Midtown toward the river where the buildings thinned out. I figured if the creatures were hunting by sound, staying away from cluttered intersections might buy me some time. The first few blocks were slow going. I avoided open streets, weaving between dumpsters, broken scaffolding, and half-collapsed delivery entrances. Twice I spotted patrols of soldiers moving in small, silent groups. They didn't shout orders or carry radios that crackled with noise. They communicated with hand signals only, rifles at the ready. They were clearly trying to avoid detection too. I didn't call out to them. I wasn't sure if they'd help or leave me behind. Somewhere around 3rd Avenue and 45th, I found the wreckage of a news van crushed beneath one of the fallen alien shards. The logo on the side had been burned away, but a camera was still intact, hanging from its tripod near the gutter. Blood stained the sidewalk, and several bodies were half buried under the edge of the debris. A shredded emergency alert placard lay nearby, the kind used during disaster broadcasts. It was just the word silence, printed in bold black letters across the top, and underneath, any sound will provoke them. Seeing it in print made it feel more real than anything I'd heard on the loudspeakers. I crouched behind an overturned taxi for several minutes after that, just watching and listening. A man in a grey hoodie sprinted across the avenue a few blocks ahead of me, waving a flare over his head. I had no idea what he was doing, maybe trying to distract them so others could escape, but it didn't last long. One of the creatures emerged from a smashed FedEx building, stepped into view like it had been waiting, and lunged. It was almost too fast to follow. The man vanished behind a crushed box truck. There wasn't even a scream, just silence again. I headed south, sticking close to the east side, and eventually reached the side of my apartment building around 3 p.m. The front entrance was blocked by debris, so I went around back to the service alley. My building had a fire escape, and I remembered once locking myself out and climbing it to the 3rd floor, where I'd left a window cracked. I hadn't thought I'd be grateful for that screw-up. The alley was narrow, the buildings pressing in tight but empty. I climbed slowly, carefully, testing each rung for rust or weakness. When I reached my floor, I slipped in through the window into my kitchen. The power was out, and the place felt colder than it should have. I moved through the rooms, checking to make sure the door was locked, the blinds drawn. Everything inside was just as I left it, but it felt different now. The walls felt thinner, the windows felt fragile. I pulled a blanket down from the hall closet and covered the bottom of the door to block sound and light. Then I curled up behind the couch, just listening. Every so often, I'd hear them passing by, those deep, weighty footsteps that didn't belong in a city. Once, a car alarm went off across the street, a weak, dying bleat. Less than 30 seconds later, I heard shattering glass and a metallic shriek that faded into quiet. It didn't come back on. By evening, the sky outside was a deep orange, but the city remained cloaked in haze. I hadn't seen any aircraft for hours. No helicopters, no jets, not even birds. It felt like the city had been blanketed with something thick and invisible, like the atmosphere itself was wrong. I tried to eat, but I couldn't swallow more than a few bites of a granola bar. Even chewing felt dangerous. As night fully fell, I realized I wasn't alone in the building. I heard faint movement in the apartment above mine, slow footsteps and something scraping across the floor, like furniture being pushed. At first I thought it might be one of the creatures, but then I heard a muffled sob, a woman's voice, followed by a child whispering something. I didn't dare knock on the ceiling or call out. I couldn't even risk tapping on a pipe. They were on their own, and so was I. Around midnight, the city erupted with sound. Somewhere to the west, maybe Times Square or Hell's Kitchen, a massive explosion echoed through the streets, followed by gunfire. Automatic, sustained, then cut short. I peeked through a slit in my window and saw red-orange light pulsing in the distance. Maybe it was a counterattack. Maybe someone trying to push them back. But then the creatures came. I heard them tearing through buildings, crushing cars, moving in packs. It sounded like they were clearing a whole section of the city. I stayed huddled in the darkness, holding my breath as long as I could, then exhaling into the couch cushion to muffle the sound. Sometime after 2 a.m., I finally drifted into a shallow sleep. Not rest, just the kind of sleep your body forces on you when you've used everything you've got to stay alert. I woke to silence. True silence. No distant gunfire, no engines, not even sirens. Just the faint hum of wind through the busted frame of the fire escape. I sat there in the dark for a long time, trying to convince myself I was still alive. That next morning, I risked venturing out again. I knew staying in my apartment wasn't sustainable. No water pressure, no electricity, no food besides what was in a couple cabinets. I packed a small bag with whatever I could carry, some food and water, a flashlight, a change of clothes. I wrapped everything in towels to deaden the sound and tied a scarf around my shoes to muffle my steps. I felt ridiculous, but then I thought about the man who ran through the intersection with a flare. I made my way back down the fire escape and started heading south. My goal was to reach the old ferry terminal at Battery Park. I didn't have a plan beyond that, but I remembered hearing someone mention on the office group chat the day before that evacuations might be happening by water. That might have been a rumor, or completely outdated, but it was the only lead I had. Staying put meant starvation. Moving meant risk. I chose risk. The city looked worse in daylight. Cars had been reduced to twisted husks. Buildings I'd walked past for years were gutted. Scorched rebar jutted from holes in the sidewalks. A pile of bodies, civilians and soldiers alike, lay half buried in the ruins of an NYPD precinct near 34th Street. Someone had spray-painted "Stay Silent" in black across the side of a police cruiser. That warning appeared again and again, scrawled on bus stops, sidewalks, even the sides of food trucks. By the time I made it to Union Square, I had seen 3 more of the creatures at a distance, all of them moving with the same hunting rhythm. They didn't patrol randomly. They moved toward disturbances, noises, motion, echoes. They weren't chaotic. They were surgical. The way they struck reminded me of sonar-guided missiles, as if they triangulated and eliminated anything that made noise. In the park itself, I found a group of survivors hiding inside the basement of a bookstore. Someone had rigged a blackout curtain across the entrance and left a piece of cardboard wedged under a brick with the words, "Safe below, no talking." I hesitated, but stepped inside. It was dark, musty, and packed with maybe 15 people, most of them huddled in silence on the floor. A woman in a scarf offered me a bottle of water and pointed to a sign that said, "No speaking, no whispering, no exceptions." No one greeted me, no one asked questions. They just watched me settle in, nodded, and returned to their own world of quiet. Most had makeshift gear, scarves tied over mouths, blankets used as sound-deadening wraps. Some wore their socks over shoes. I took a place near the corner, using my jacket as a cushion against the concrete wall. In the dim light cast by a single battery-powered lantern, I could make out their faces. They were all ordinary people. A man in a business suit without a tie, slumped against a shelf of travel guides. An elderly couple holding hands tightly without moving. A teenage girl writing something in a notebook with a pencil. The silence wasn't just a survival tactic. It had become ritual. We all understood it now. Sound was the enemy. We spent most of that day listening. Through the floor above, faint and distant but unmistakable, came the sounds of the city breaking apart. Not in one single explosion, but in steady, relentless fractures. Somewhere on the far side of the square, a fire burned for hours. No one opened the curtain to look. Even the creak of the door hinges felt like a risk. When we moved slowly, deliberately, with every movement calculated to keep vibrations from echoing. I opened a protein bar at one point and took almost a full minute just to unwrap it without a snap. I chewed with my mouth closed and swallowed slowly. Fear changes you. Sound becomes something physical, something alive. Late that afternoon, as the lantern dimmed, something overhead shifted. The silence broke. Not from us, but from above. At first it was only a mechanical hum, then a whooshing thunder. People sat up straighter. A few crawled toward the blackout curtain, careful not to disturb it. I followed one man and peered through a thin seam between the fabric and the wall. Outside, the sky was darkening again, but this time not from smoke. There were helicopters. 3 of them flew in formation above the park, large military models, not news choppers or NYPD birds. Twin rotors. You could feel the vibration before you heard the engines. As they passed overhead, I saw soldiers leaning out of the side doors, holding megaphones and shouting down to the streets below. The voice was amplified, but distorted by the wind. I could only make out a few words at first, but then it came through clear. The creatures fear water. Go to the water. Repeat. The creatures fear water. Safe zones established along piers. Ferries operating for evacuation. Head to the water. Stay low. Move quietly. Go to the water. It repeated again and again, circling downtown. The helicopters moved south along Broadway, broadcasting in loops. For the first time in nearly 2 days, we were hearing something that sounded like a plan. Not speculation, not screams, orders. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then we heard the creatures respond. They came from every direction, as if they'd been waiting for a target. The sound of the helicopters had drawn them like bait. I don't know how many there were, more than we'd seen before. They didn't move like a patrol, they moved like a wave. We heard one crash through a nearby building, its limbs tearing through walls and windows as if they were paper. The entire street groaned under the weight of its passage. Somewhere, Someone must have screamed in response. Another creature answered, hammering the side of a parked bus into the building next door until the metal screamed. That horrible roar followed, deep and rolling, like something echoing inside the earth itself. Inside the basement, no one moved. The noise above was deafening, concrete shattering, glass raining down, metal twisting. The helicopters didn't turn back. They continued heading south, shouting their message. But each second they flew, they attracted more of the creatures. I couldn't see the damage directly, but I saw what was left behind. An entire row of buildings on the west side of the park had their fronts torn open. Fires burned out of control. Storefronts collapsed like cardboard. Somewhere in the chaos, one of the helicopters was hit. Its rotors cut out mid-turn, and it dropped sideways behind a high-rise. A second later, a bloom of black smoke marked where it went down. We waited in that basement for over an hour after the sounds died down. It wasn't just fear that kept us still. It was understanding. Those of us who had survived this long knew the creatures didn't leave right away. They lingered. They waited. They hunted. When we finally moved again, it was because we knew we had to. The bookstore's food had been picked clean. No power, no water. The few of us who had made eye contact during the helicopter flyover began pointing south, toward the river. One man used a piece of chalk to sketch a crude map on the floor, showing a path through the lower east side to the Battery Park ferry terminal. The logic was sound. If the evacuation had any chance of being real, it would happen from the southern tip of the island. But it wasn't logic that forced us out of hiding. It was need. We left in silence. The blackout curtain was peeled back just wide enough for people to slip out one at a time. I was near the middle of the group, behind a tall woman in a long coat and in front of a man who smelled like diesel fuel. We moved along the edge of the buildings, avoiding the open park lawn, staying low and out of sight. No one spoke, not even the child that one woman carried wrapped against her chest. The city was in ruins. Broadway looked like a war zone. The asphalt was torn in places where the creatures had moved through, leaving craters and trails of shattered concrete. Streetlights were bent or missing entirely. Storefronts were gutted, and in some places, the interiors looked like they'd been scooped out with claws. We crossed cautiously through Union Square, which now resembled a graveyard of scorched metal and melted glass. We traveled block by block, pausing every time we heard a distant thud or rumble. At 14th Street, we lost 2 people. A rusted-out newspaper stand collapsed when someone brushed against it, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The group scattered instantly, hiding behind parked cars and in doorways. A creature crashed through the side of a parking garage, moving straight for the source of the noise. The 2 who had bumped the stand were gone in seconds. One of them tried to run, but it was hopeless. The thing reached him mid-stride, cleaving through a mailbox and dragging him into the wreckage. No one looked back. We regrouped half a block later, thinner and quieter than before. South of Houston Street, the damage grew worse. The fallen alien shards were larger, angled like metallic roots plunging from the sky into the buildings below. Some pulsed faintly, like they were alive, like they were humming with some deep internal energy. I didn't want to get close enough to find out. Just before Canal Street, we stopped to rest in a broken laundromat. The front window had been blasted out, and a row of dryers was torn from the wall. There were scorch marks across the tile. We sat silently among the overturned chairs and mangled detergent bottles. One man, the one who had chalked the route earlier, scribbled another map onto the wall with a broken hanger, updating our direction. The ferries would be near the Staten Island terminal, if they were still there at all. The group was smaller now. Only 10 of us remained. Most sat with their backs against walls or curled in corners where they could see both the front and rear of the store. No one relaxed. We hadn't earned the right to feel safe. The only movement came from the woman with the baby, carefully adjusting a cloth between her shoulder and the child's face to keep any soft noises muffled. The rest of us kept our hands on our bags or weapons, makeshift things like wrenches, hammers, or sharpened pipes, and stared into nothing. We waited for daylight to give us enough contrast to move through the urban wreckage ahead. Around 5 a.m., a pale grey light began pushing through the gaps between buildings. The sun wasn't visible through the smoke, but it was enough to see by. We rose in silence, moving with practiced rhythm, each person scanning the way forward before the next followed. We stuck to the narrow streets south of Chinatown, using collapsed scaffolding and abandoned vehicles as cover. The towers of the financial district loomed in the distance, casting distorted shadows through the haze. Just past Lafayette and Walker, we found what used to be a small grocery store. The facade was cracked open, its steel security gate bent upward like a peeled tin can. Shelves were knocked over inside, but some of the signage still hung from the ceiling. Dairy, baked goods, dry storage. The interior looked like it had been looted, but not completely. Someone in the group, a man in a dusty red jacket, gestured toward it and then mimed eating. Another woman nodded. After a few seconds of silent consideration, 4 of them began carefully slipping through the wreckage toward the open entrance. I didn't follow right away. My instinct told me to keep moving, but I hadn't eaten in nearly a full day. What food I'd taken from my apartment was long gone, and we didn't know how far the walk would be from here to the ferries, or how long we'd wait once we got there. Hunger does strange things to the body. It makes your judgment soft around the edges. After a moment's hesitation, I crouched low and crept toward the shattered storefront. Inside, the place was a mess. Broken glass crunched faintly underfoot, and every surface seemed coated in a fine layer of soot and plaster dust. The air stank of spoiled meat and chemical rot. A few cans had been knocked under a shelving unit, and I spotted a dusty box of dry cereal wedged behind a tipped-over crate. I pocketed both, wrapping them in a scarf to muffle the sound. The other scavengers were doing the same. One person filled a tote bag with snack bars and 2 bottles of water. No one made eye contact. There was no time for gratitude, just survival. But then, a problem happened. A huge, deadly problem. Someone near the dairy section misjudged their step. It might have been fatigue, or nerves, or just bad luck. Their foot landed directly on a jagged piece of broken freezer glass that had been hidden beneath some paper debris. The sound wasn't loud, a dry, brittle crack, but in that suffocating silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. Everyone froze. The man who had stepped on it clamped his hand over his mouth, eyes wide. He didn't move. None of us did. For a second, there was only quiet. Then the air changed. The sound came from above, distant at first, but growing with unnatural speed. A shrieking whistle, like wind being forced through massive, twisting ducts. It wasn't a mechanical noise. It was alive. It was screaming. The building shuddered under impact. The roof caved in toward the rear corner as something massive tore through it from above. I didn't wait to see what. I dove toward a row of metal shelves, crawling between fallen displays until I reached a service hatch near the back room. I hauled myself up through it, scrambling over exposed pipes and into the crawl space between the ceiling and the interior roof frame. It was narrow, barely enough to turn around, but it was something. Below me, all hell had broken loose. I heard the crunch of plaster as a second impact collapsed the front entrance. Something else dropped into the store like a meteor. The floor cracked and buckled. I didn't scream. I didn't breathe. I just clenched my fingers around a support beam and stayed as still as the dead. Through the gaps in the ceiling panels, I could see movement below, not like the shadowy blurs from a distance. This was the first time I saw one of the creatures up close. It was massive, its back scraping the edges of the ceiling support structure, its limbs folding like the arms of a robotic mantis. Every surface of its body shifted with faint pulsing lines, like muscle covered in hardened exoskeleton. Its head was the same jagged dish-shaped structure I'd glimpsed before, but up close I could see the detail. A cluster of small nodules ringed the base of the dish, all pulsing with a faint blue glow. Dozens of filamentous tendrils quivered from its crown, waving in the air, sweeping the ground. They made no sound, but they seemed to taste every corner of the room. Another one dropped through the collapsed rear. The floorboards shattered beneath it. It didn't walk. It unfolded. The motion was too precise, too fluid. These weren't animals. They were something else entirely. Something grown, or built, or bred for one purpose. They moved toward the point where the glass had broken, heads angled down, filaments twitching. The man who had stepped on the glass tried to run. I saw him in the gap, crawling toward a toppled cart, mouth open in silent terror. The creatures turned in unison, limbs lifting. He never made it to the doorway. They struck the ground with such force the air itself seemed to rupture. He vanished in the cloud of debris. I didn't see what they did to the others. I only saw the shadow of what remained. The two monsters circled each other, moving in patterns that seemed rehearsed. Their heads shifted, sweeping the room, and then they stopped. I couldn't tell if they sensed me. I couldn't move. I pressed my forehead into the dust-coated metal beam, clenched my jaw to keep from shaking, and waited. Minutes passed. It might have been 10, maybe more. I could feel the weight of them in the building. Every motion, every step, vibrated through the beams. Then, finally, I heard one of them leap through the ruined storefront, the screech of twisted metal marking its departure. The other followed seconds later. I waited longer still before moving, long after the sounds had faded. I crawled back toward the service hatch and dropped down silently into what remained of the back room. Smoke curled from a ruptured pipe. Cans and packaging were shredded across the floor. The wall near the freezer section was painted in something I didn't want to identify. Of the others who had entered with me, none remained. I stood there for a moment, knees bent slightly, trying to hear past the ringing in my ears. The front of the store was completely unrecognizable. Where the entrance had once been was now a torn hole. Concrete splintered outward, twisted metal beams half folded into themselves, counters and signage reduced to broken fragments. A single shopping cart sat upside down against a broken display shelf, its wheels still faintly spinning, as if the last motion hadn't yet finished. The only color in the place came from scattered packaging and twisted foil that glinted in the soft grey daylight filtering through the roof. I heard nothing. No more movement. No clicks. No scraping limbs. Nothing breathing that wasn't me. I crept outside the way I'd entered, slipping between the loading dock's warped steel doors and crouching behind a concrete divider where a delivery van had once parked. The air outside was thick again, smoke clinging low to the street, ash hanging in the sunlight like snow that had lost its way. My scarf was damp with sweat and dust. I adjusted it around my mouth and checked the street with slow, shallow breaths. Something was wrong. The others were supposed to be waiting nearby. We'd always regrouped after moving through a dangerous zone, no matter what. But the block was empty. The city was never silent. But this was something deeper, like the noise had been pulled out of the air entirely. At first I didn't see them. I stepped over a broken curb and angled past the rear of the city bus where they'd last been hiding. That's when I saw what was left behind. The road had been crushed inward, like a crater had formed in the asphalt. Several of the steel barriers we'd passed earlier were scattered and bent like soda cans. On the far side of the wreckage, I spotted a single boot, torn from a foot, half submerged in a puddle of soot-streaked water. A few feet from that, something darker caught the light. I moved closer before I realized what it was. A jacket, flattened and shredded, still partly covering the remains of the tall woman in the long coat who had walked ahead of me earlier that day. Her head was turned at an unnatural angle, her eyes open but vacant, and the lower half of her body was obscured beneath a collapsed street sign. It looked like she'd tried to run, or maybe she never got the chance. A few yards beyond her, another figure was sprawled in what used to be the entrance to a newsstand. His back was bent in a way no spine should bend, one arm twisted under him. The newspaper rack beside him was split down the middle. There was no blood, not the kind that runs in pools or splashes across the ground. The bodies had been struck with such force that it was as if everything had been internalized, compressed, broken from the inside out. I backed away slowly, keeping my feet on the clearer portions of sidewalk. The others were gone. No sign of retreat. No trail to follow. Just these two bodies, twisted where they'd stood, and the eerie stillness of a street that had just devoured the rest. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but nothing came. There was no time to mourn. No ceremony. No goodbye. These were people I had walked beside, hidden beside, watched move through the worst of it with steady eyes and silent determination. And now they were wreckage, anonymous and forgotten. I felt a hollow ache where my voice used to be. But still, I said nothing. I moved south again, alone now. The streets narrowed as I crossed into the edge of the Seaport district. Every few blocks I paused behind a delivery van or wrecked sedan to scan the area. The ground was more uneven here. In some places, the concrete had been peeled upward, like a fist had punched through from underneath. Sewer lines gurgled open, releasing clouds of steam that reeked of mold and sulfur. I saw no more creatures, but I also saw no survivors. Only signs of what had been. Bent bicycles, shattered phones, open backpacks with contents spilled as if dropped mid-step. Eventually, I came across an overturned NYPD cruiser near Front Street. Its doors were open, the lights dead, the radio silent. A body lay nearby, an officer by the look of the uniform, though his vest was gone and his sidearm missing. One of his arms was reaching upward, the fingers stiff. His face was partially buried beneath crumbled cement, but I recognized the insignia on the sleeve. I didn't check for a pulse. There was no point. Inside the cruiser, I found a sealed medpack and an emergency evac map folded behind the passenger seat. The map was water damaged but still legible. Pier 11 evacuation staging, priority medical and civilian transport. I traced my finger from the marked courthouse barricade to my current location. I was only 4 blocks away, closer than I'd thought. But those 4 blocks felt longer than the miles I'd already walked. The city had grown crueler as I moved south, the damage more surgical, the silence more absolute. At Water Street, I found what looked like a temporary checkpoint, now deserted. There were MRE wrappers scattered in the gutter, a canvas canopy shredded and flapping in the wind, and a long smear across the sidewalk where something heavy had been dragged. A discarded walkie-talkie buzzed softly with static beneath a table. I didn't touch it. Sound was still the enemy. A few blocks later, I reached the edge of South Street and saw the piers. The wide expanse of the East River opened ahead of me, and for the first time in days, I tasted clean wind. The smoke didn't sit as heavy here. The air moved faster across the water. I crouched behind a metal barrier and scanned the terminal. The terminal was still there, but it wasn't what I expected. One ferry sat idling at the dock, engine rumbling softly. A group of soldiers stood around it, dressed in dark gear, rifles slung but not raised. One man held a megaphone, though he wasn't using it. A small cluster of civilians huddled near the ramp, no more than 10 or 15 people, most of them kneeling or sitting with their backs to crates. They looked exhausted. They looked like me. I stayed low and crept toward them, not running, just moving with purpose. There was no cover in the last stretch, only the open lot between me and the ferry, and that space felt like a trap. I waited behind a shattered phone booth, counted to 60, then moved. The soldiers didn't stop me. One glanced in my direction and nodded once. That was all. I reached the group in a daze. Someone handed me a water bottle. Another pushed a foil-wrapped food bar into my hand. No words, just gestures. We were all too far past talking now. A medic moved through the crowd with a clipboard, checking vitals and tagging each person with a strip of red tape. I was marked just like the others. I didn't recognize anyone. The people around me were a collection of survivors drawn from places I'd never seen. Men and women with faces hardened by exhaustion, soot-smudged clothing, bandaged limbs. Some were dressed like civilians, others like transit workers, maybe volunteers who hadn't made it out with their teams. No one looked like they wanted to speak. Most of us just watched the soldiers as they moved among us, never far from their weapons but not aiming them either. The ferry vibrated gently under our feet, engine idling, ready to move. But we hadn't left. Not yet. There were murmurs, movements between the soldiers. A lieutenant walked the length of the dock speaking quietly into a radio, pausing to glance down towards South Street before continuing to the other end. I followed his line of sight but couldn't see what he was watching. It was the kind of posture you develop when something is closing in, when there's no more time to plan, only time to brace. They were waiting for a window. That much was obvious. Maybe for other evacuees, maybe for the all clear. But we were still too exposed. Every instinct I had left told me that. The city was still behind us, breathing its silence, hiding its shapes behind buildings and clouds. That silence was worse than any alarm. It stretched, pulled taut like wire about to snap. Then, From the distance, it came. Not the sound of engines or gunfire. Something else. A wave of sharp, high-pitched clicks rising like static over the rooftops. It was faint at first, like metal being scraped across glass, but it built quickly, and when I turned toward the sound, I saw them. They moved across the rooftops in clusters, 4, maybe 5 of them. Those same towering creatures, their limbs bent backwards like mechanical cranes, their heads scanning the air. Their motions were erratic at first, like they were still tracking, but the moment one of the ferry engines flared, even just slightly, they changed course. They heard it. They all heard it. The lieutenant didn't speak. He raised one arm and made a sharp rotating gesture. 2 soldiers pulled the boarding ramp free from the pier. Another slammed the hatch closed. The entire group on deck shifted, not in panic, but in readiness. Some stood, some crouched low behind crates, hands braced, eyes forward. No screaming, no running. The fear had burned through us already. The ferry engine rumbled louder, turning slowly, pushing against the current. We began to move, just enough to put distance between us and the pier. The creatures dropped to street level with horrifying force, bodies slamming into the pavement like thunder. 2 of them charged the waterline, limbs striking the ground in fast, unnatural bursts. One of them vaulted onto a toppled crane, then leapt again, crashing through the side of a building that stood beside the harbour road. They weren't just following, they were adapting. I crouched near a coil of rope on the deck, hands gripping the rusted rail as the ferry churned into the river. One of the creatures sprinted to the edge of Pier 15 and stopped there, dish-like head tilting in eerie silence as its filaments waved in the river wind. It didn't follow us into the water, but it paced along the dock, tapping the ground, testing the vibrations. Another crouched further back, crawling over the crushed remains of a subway entrance like a spider ready to pounce. They didn't like the water, but they were watching. The ferry didn't slow down. It pulled east into deeper water, veering south toward Governor's Island before cutting west, skirting the edge of the lower bay. For a while, we didn't say anything. No one did. Just the rumble of the engine and the sloshing wake behind us. The city faded into the distance. A bruised skyline of broken windows, collapsed bridges, and alien obelisks piercing the clouds like the bones of something long buried now rising again. An older man beside me, dressed in a torn maintenance jacket, finally broke the silence in a low, scratchy whisper. "They're learning." No one answered him. He didn't speak again. We passed by another ferry drifting just north of Red Hook, its lights off, its deck empty. It hadn't made it far from the docks. The windows were shattered, and what looked like the remains of an improvised barricade sat tangled in the railings. We didn't stop. We didn't even slow down. The river was full of things like that. Half-sunken boats, smoke trailing from water taxis, even a few people waving from a rooftop on the far side of Brooklyn. The soldiers didn't acknowledge them. They kept their eyes on the shore, rifles cradled, but not raised. Their job was simple now: get us across. We reached Staten Island around 40 minutes later. The landing zone was a cargo dock just south of the old ferry terminal, reinforced with makeshift fencing, sandbags, and floodlights. There were people there, not many, but enough to suggest something was still working on this side of the water. A processing tent, a generator humming softly, one antenna broadcasting a looping signal on a small shortwave tower. "This is Forward Site Echo, civilian reception zone. If you are hearing this message, make your way to safe water and await retrieval." We disembarked in single file, still silent, still watching every step. The soldiers formed a half circle around us as we moved toward the tents. A medic scanned the tape on my wrist, checked my eyes with a small flashlight, and moved me along. A younger man in glasses handed me a dry blanket. I didn't ask his name. I didn't ask what came next. They gave us beds in an open shelter, a converted warehouse lined with cots and emergency heaters. No privacy, no warmth beyond what came from proximity, but it was better than asphalt, better than ceiling panels and rebar and duct tape over window seams. I laid down on one of the cots and stared at the corrugated metal above me, listening to the groan of steel in the wind and the distant hum of the river. Later that night, as I sat wrapped in my blanket near the dock's edge, I looked back toward the Manhattan skyline. Most of it was dark, broken only by the flicker of burning buildings or the eerie blue glow of those alien spires still pulsing in the mist. One of the soldiers nearby leaned against a crate, eyes half-lidded, smoking a cigarette. He didn't say anything to me, but after a moment, he pointed out toward the horizon and nodded. There, near the southern edge of the city, something new was rising. It wasn't a building, it wasn't a ship. It looked like a structure unfolding from one of the larger fallen shards, an open lattice of bone-colored scaffolding and dark, webbed material being stretched and spun into place like the beginning of a hive. It moved slowly, steadily, lit from within by that same unnatural pulse. It wasn't a landing site, it wasn't a weapon. It was a base, a nest, a permanent claim. I didn't sleep after that. I knew we hadn't escaped. We'd just bought a few hours, maybe a day. They weren't done. They weren't retreating. They were settling in. And the only thing that still kept us alive was silence. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.